Amidst its explosive and dynamic action sequences, there's one major aspect of Attack on Titan that I believe goes relatively unnoticed. From the onset of the series, it becomes painfully obvious that humanity is at a huge disadvantage in their struggle against the Titans, and having been dealt such a bad hands, our protagonists suffer defeat far more than they achieve victory. And one major aspect of this defeat is the presence of death in Attack on Titan. Interestingly enough, I've never really heard anyone talk about how death is handled in Attack on Titan, and until a scene that I recently watched in Season 3, I never really thought about it much myself. And I believe a major part of why death is so underrated or so slept on is the actual death scenes themselves are kind of underwhelming. I mean, a lot of times we get introduced to a character and then like 2 episodes later, or the same episode, they die, and we never get their backstory. We never learn their motivations. We, never even really get to meet them. And a lot of times, the people that die are straight up just unnamed, or we don't care to remember their name. So it creates this effect like,
oh no, Levi Squad, they're dead.
Oh, so sad. He's so sad. Except for when Petra died. That wrecked me.
Petra, no!
So it's the insignificance of the characters that die in Attack on Titan that kind of makes the whole idea of death kind of bland. Or so I thought, until I saw one specific scene in Season 3 of Attack on Titan that went to recontextualize all the deaths prior in the series, and gave weight to the deaths that were seemingly meaningless. And this scene actually changed my perspective, and it made me realize that the deaths being insignificant and underwhelming is kind of the point. You see, death serves 3 purposes within the narrative of Attack on Titan. The first is to illustrate the cost of victory. The second is to depict the psychological weight that death can have on the people who survive the battle. And the third, well, we'll get to that later, don't want to reveal all my tricks right now. For context, Attack on Titan is set in a world where humanity is in a never-ending struggle against a force of giant man-eating monsters called Titans. In order to protect themselves, they erected 3 layers of walls and congregated inside of these walls, and established a military as well to actively combat Titans. There's 3 branches of the military, and each of them have their own unique role in the fight against the Titans. The garrison troops protect the walls, and by extension, the citizens inside the walls. The military police keep the peace inside the innermost wall rose, and the scouts act as humanity's spear and bring the fight straight to the Titans. They go outside of the walls and search for information. In a lot of anime, there's relatively no lasting consequences to the actions that the protagonist takes. Usually they just stroll up in there, beat the bad guy, and then continue on their journey. And Attack on Titan can kind of feel this way at first, because even though with every loss that humanity takes, people die, usually it's just background characters. Very rarely do main characters die, and it seems like the old background characters just get replaced with new background characters. The difference between Attack on Titan, however, and your average Joe series is that these relatively insignificant deaths begin to add up. And that led to this scene in Season 3 that completely changed my perspective on death in the series.
どうだ? わかったか、アルミ?
まず調査兵団はここにいる9人で全員なんですか?
When Eren, the protagonist, and his friends joined the scouting regiment, not only were there about 300 members, but also these members were introduced to us as an elite fighting force. They felled the Titans that were killing our recruits like it was nothing. Like, they straight up kept kill counts of all the Titans that they killed. Like, their KD was a positive KD among positive KDs, bro. 12 kills, 0 deaths. These guys were the stuff. And getting the revelation that throughout the series, all of them died was so surreal. And not only that, but the seemingly insignificant nature of their deaths, because their deaths specifically didn't leave much of an impression on me, this revelation snuck up on me. I wasn't expecting it because, background characters just get replaced with more background characters. But then we realized that there are no more background characters. In their struggle for victory against the Titans, humanity has sacrificed almost everyone. Having this scene proceed, the greatest victory humanity has won up to this point in the series, makes the victory so much more impactful, because I understand what it took to get to this point. I understand what the obstacles the protagonist had to overcome to reach this point. I understand the cost of victory. The presence of death in Attack on Titan enhances the series on a thematic level because at its core, Attack on Titan is a story about war, and the death really highlights or emphasizes the sacrifice behind victory. If that were all, however, I believe death would still be lacking, because even though it enhances the narrative on a thematic level, on a plot level, outside of those few scenes where the theme of the cost of victory is the explicit focus of the scene, that's what we're focusing on in the scene, you know, that theme really isn't felt throughout the plot of the show. So in order for the death to have meaning or impact throughout the entirety of the series, there have to be further reaching narrative implications of death. And this is rectified by the effect that death has on its characters. Eren, the main character, gets captured a lot throughout the series, and initially he thinks that he's really special because he can turn into a Titan, but throughout the series he begins to realize as he learns more about the world that he's really not anything special. And the revelation that he's not special, along with the acute awareness that he has that people are sacrificing their lives to save him, begins to break him. He's unable to fathom that humanity is putting all their hopes on him, and at the same time he's beginning to understand the pressure that causes, and also how unfit he is for the job. This conflict really serves as the crux for his character progression throughout the entirety of Season 3. Captain Levi loses 2 of his squads throughout the series, and we see how that makes him emotionally numb and how the loss that he's incurred informs his decisions as a fighter. But the most impactful of these characters is the commander of the scouts, Erwin Smith. In the Battle of Oniganshima, as he's faced with his own mortality, he begins to reflect on his life. He begins to reflect on his hopes, his dreams, his aspiration. And he says that everything he's done to achieve his dream. And he reflects, he says there's so many times that death would have been much easier, but yet he decided he needed to live in order to achieve his dream. He needed to live and continue to live. And he knows the sacrifices that he's made in order to achieve this dream. And so when he's reflected, or when he's faced with his own mortality, with his own death, and realizes that he'll never be able to achieve his dream, he also begins to think of all of his comrades that he sacrificed along the way. People that have had absolute faith in his command, and people that he knowingly sent to their deaths. He says to his closest friend, "Can you see them? Can you see our comrades? I wonder what became of the hearts that they gave us. How have we continued on their legacy? What have we done to carry the torch?" You see, he knows that he is by no means innocent, and the guilt that he feels from all the people that he's left in his wake as he's tried to fulfill his dream is contrasted with the intense desire to continue to want to fulfill his dream. And it's this conflict inside of him that makes his character so engaging every time he's on screen during Season 3. So Death in Attack on Titan not only has amazing thematic relevance with its idea of the cost of victory, but it also carries narrative relevance because it serves as the impetus of most of the character development and character progression throughout the series. The final purpose of Death in Attack on Titan is to illustrate a complex view on the futility of war. So even though the primary focus of Attack on Titan is detailing humanity's struggle and, I believe, eventual victory against the Titans, a prevalent theme throughout is that the struggle really isn't even worth it. Even though in the Battle of Oniganshima at the end of Season 3, humanity has won its greatest victory to that point. They figured out so much about the world, and for the first time they have a fighting chance in this war against the Titans. Some could argue that the sacrifices made in achieving that victory weren't even worth what was gained. You see, if you look into World War I, there was something called trench warfare, and basically both sides would build these trenches, and they would dig these trenches and fortify them, and because of the way the trenches were built, pretty much the only way to overtake the enemy was to rush the trench front on. And this kind of fighting was brutal. It was the bloodiest fighting in human history. And really, it was super inefficient because a lot of times you'd have both sides building these trenches and they would fight for extended periods of time, and the lines between who controlled more territory didn't move that much. So you might have 100 or 200 soldiers die in an effort to gain a mile of territory. And when you really think about that, you know, I can walk the length of a mile in like 15 minutes. And if you weigh 100 lives versus the amount of territory gained, it doesn't even seem worth it. It's like, it's so insignificant compared to how much it cost. So if it's so insignificant, why even fight in the first place? And even though I don't think that's what Imayama, the author, is trying to convey per se, I don't necessarily think that this is the main message that he's trying to convey, that war is futile. I believe he presents this idea as a legitimate perspective and gives the audience the choice of whether they want to believe that it's futile or whether they want to believe that it has meaning. And I think it's a super powerful theme that death plays an integral role in communicating. We see this conflict presented to us in episode 16 of season 3, where the soldiers are presented with a choice. They either stay where they are and get crushed by rubble, or they attempt a suicide charge in the hopes that one person will be able to dispatch the enemy. There's a character within the new recruits in the scout regiment that begins to question. He's like, wait a second, if we're gonna die either way, are you just saying it's better to die fighting than to die standing here? And Erwin, the commander of the scouts, says, yeah, you're absolutely right. And he's like, well, I mean, if it doesn't matter, we're gonna die, then we can disobey orders, can't we? He's like, yeah, you're right. And he's like, wait, then our lives, everything up to this point, if we're just gonna die anyway, isn't it meaningless? And Erwin gives an impassioned speech about what gives lives meaning. He says, the people that live on give meaning to the people who have fallen. He tells the soldier, would you look at your fallen comrades and tell them that their lives were meaningless? However, both sides of the argument are presented as equals. And coincidentally, the only person to survive that suicide charge was the one person who questioned whether it was even worth it to fight in the first place. And several of the characters, when facing the moment of their death, begin to reflect and think of how good it was when they just lived inside the walls and didn't have to worry about it. So, Imayama presents this theme of the futility of the struggle as a legitimate perspective on war. He doesn't tell us which character is right, Erwin or this random recruit. Rather, he leaves it up to the audience to decide. And in reality, it's probably not either of them. It's probably a mix of both. You know, it's probably not as simple as black and white, like many things aren't. The way death is handled in Attack on Titan allows it to stand out as an incredibly realistic portrayal of war despite its fantastical setting. Many of the deaths are unknown characters and seemingly insignificant or underwhelming, but that's kinda how war is. The critically acclaimed Dunkirk forgoes even giving most of its characters names. I believe none of the characters are named, actually. And if you look at the movie, the idea is to portray the soldiers as everyone is just another face within the effort. Attack on Titan manages to use death to emulate the seemingly insignificant nature of the sacrifices within war. And with its portrayal of death, it depicts the psychological trauma inflicted on those left behind, and it communicates the dichotomy between the pointlessness of sacrifice and also the reality that meaningful victory is only achieved through great sacrifice. Hope you guys enjoyed this vid, hoping to make more analysis videos in the future. If you liked the video, leave a like and a comment, and make sure to